And there's no stake for me in here. These people don't represent me. These people don't even look like me. These aren't even my people. I hear you. I hear what you're saying. So let's start with what we all know, but we're not supposed to say out loud, okay? The thing that unites every single person watching this, whether you're MAGA or you're libertarian or you're just some guy who hates everyone in DC, and that's this: the government. The government does not work for you. It works for special interests. It works for donors, for corporations, for anyone who can write a six-figure check, and everyone else can get fucked. This we know to be a universal truth no matter what side of the aisle you're on. So Republicans, for example, will promise you border security and limited government. Then they give you more debt, more wars, more cheap labor for their donors. They'll talk America first while fast-tracking something like 600,000 Chinese students and H-1B workers, right? They promise to fucking drain the swamp. Then they fill it with the same assholes that were in office before, the same swamp creatures from Goldman Sachs, from the neocons, from the warhawks, all of them, the defense contractors. They give you fucking useless border theater while your wages have stagnated for 40 years under their tutelage. And they'll turn your towns into Dollar General and fucking meth dens, okay? On the other side of the aisle, Democrats will promise you health care and workers' rights. Then they give you these means-tested bureaucratic nightmares that helps nobody. They promise to help working families, and then they ship your jobs to China. They'll inflate your currency. They'll flood your market with fucking illegals. And then they'll call you a racist when you notice that your little kid can't get hired at the Amazon warehouse because everyone there is Somali and nobody speaks English. They'll lecture you about privilege while your life expectancy is dropping and you're dying from fentanyl and suicide. So both parties are running the same scam, just a different flavor, different marketing. But that scam is keeping you distracted and fighting over the culture war bullshit while they rob you blind. And the result is that this country is coming apart in real time. Not in some theoretical future, but right fucking now, today. And everyone, and I mean everyone, can see this shit, except the people who benefit from pretending that it's not happening. For example, Minnesota has entire neighborhoods where Somali refugees who've been here for 20 fucking years still don't speak English. Where their kids are getting radicalized online, where honor violence and female genital mutilation are happening, and no one wants to talk about it because that's Islamophobic. Michigan has communities where Islamic cultural practices are operating parallel to American law, and cities are being, or I should say, bending to religious demands that would be unconstitutional if Christians did that. And if you mention any of this, you're a bigot. Not the people who imported populations from failed states with values completely incompatible with liberal democracy. And then they act shocked when they don't become Thomas fucking Jefferson when they arrive here. Isn't that crazy? So California, another state, they have entire cities where speaking English is actually a disadvantage. I know, I lived there before. Where you can't get a job at like something as simple as a grocery store or the DMV or a school without speaking Spanish. Where second and third generation kids still identify as Mexican first and American never, as you've seen from the protest waving Mexican flags, right? Their Mexican flags fly higher than American flags. And when you point this out, you get told that that's just their culture and you need to be more tolerant. Meanwhile, the concept of becoming American has been completely abandoned. The H-1B visa, for example, that program brings in hundreds of thousands of tech workers, not because, there's no qualified Americans, but because imported workers are cheaper and they can't job hop and will work 80 hours without complaint since their visa is tied to their employment. And when Americans who trained these fucking workers before get laid off, right? And then they'll complain about it. No, can't have that. They get called racist. They get called protectionist. Meanwhile, these workers aren't becoming American either. They're sending money back home. They're maintaining foreign allegiances. They're taking jobs and experience back to India and China. They're not immigrants. They're corporate imported labor with no expectation of integration. Border cities, they're completely fucking overrun. The infrastructure cannot handle the numbers. Hospitals are closing because they can't afford to provide free fucking care to endless waves of people who've never paid into the system. Schools are warehouses now, trying to teach kids who don't speak English. It's a nightmare. Whose parents don't speak English and whose grandparents don't speak English because we gave up on integration 3 generations ago. Entire towns have changed demographically in less than a decade. And the people who live there their whole lives are told to shut up and celebrate the diversity. Then you have sanctuary cities. This is Orwellian doublespeak for we will actively obstruct federal immigration enforcement because our political donors want cheap labor and future voters. We all know that's what it is. Prosecutors refuse to charge crimes committed by illegal immigrants because charging them might lead to deportation. And we can't have that. Policies exist. If you're here illegally, you get better healthcare and education benefits than citizens because, enforcing citizenship requirements is discriminatory somehow. Yeah. And both parties want this. You have to wake up from the left or right paradigm. Republicans want the cheap labor for their business donors and a wedge issue to campaign on without ever fixing shit. And Democrats, they want a permanent underclass that's dependent on government programs who'll vote for more government programs and who they can use as moral ammunition to call anyone who objects racist. You see, both sides want you divided by race and ethnicity and language because divided populations doesn't unite against people robbing them. You understand? So they'll flood the country with people who have no intention of integrating. They actively incentivize non-integration through bilingual everything and ethnic grievance politics, identity-based benefits. Then they act shocked when Balkanization happens. This is all the fatigue everybody is experiencing today. And then working class Americans are competing for jobs with people who work under the fucking table for cash. There's communities that exist in America where literally nobody speaks the same language or shares the same values or has any sense of being a part of the same nation. The social fabric is completely shredded. Zero trust exists between these groups. Ethnic enclaves function more like foreign countries on American soil today. And social cohesion is collapsing, and that's putting it lightly. Civic participation doesn't even exist anymore, let's be honest. Trust in institutions below cratering, straight to the depths of hell. People literally don't trust their neighbors anymore. This is the new America. And this is where we have to get to the part that makes everyone uncomfortable that I was talking about earlier. There are people who look at this situation and they'll say, you see, civic nationalism was always a lie. Diversity plus proximity equals conflict, not strength. The only solution is separation. White people need a homeland. Black people need a homeland. Hispanics, they need their territory. We can't live together, so we need to accept that and just divide the country accordingly. Sounds nice on the surface to some people, especially the ethnic nationalists, but we'll get into why not. So, and don't dismiss them as crazy, because if you're going to write these guys off as fringe lunatics, you need to understand that they're looking seriously at the same evidence that you're looking at. They're seeing the same breakdown. They're experiencing the same loss of community and shared identity. And they're coming to what would be a logical conclusion based on the data, which is that if you bring in millions of people from incompatible cultures and you don't require integration, you actually punish attempts at integration. Or I should say, and if you actually punish those attempts, you'll get called racist, right? And assimilation, that's a pipe dream. You're going to get tribalism, ethnic conflict, the breakdown of civic society itself. Look at the last 20, 30 years. They'll look at Europe, for example, and they see the future. You got third-generation Turks in Germany who still don't speak German. And they wave Turkish flags and they vote in Turkish elections while collecting German welfare. You got Pakistani grooming gangs in England. They're operating there for decades while the police ignore it because investigating would be racist. There's the French suburbs where police don't go and Islamic law is enforced by religious patrols. That's insane. These are Western nations. Or Sweden, fucking shithole. Neighborhoods that are war zones with grenade attacks and bombings. gang violence that didn't exist just only 20 years ago. Entire cities transformed demographically where native populations are now minorities in their own communities. And they see the same thing starting in America. For example, you have Somali gangs in Minnesota. You have MS-13 in Virginia. You have cartel violence spilling over the border. The communities are transformed overnight, where the people who lived there for generations suddenly can't recognize their own neighborhoods. And they come to the conclusion, and it's a very simple one. This is what happens when you try to force diverse populations together without assimilation. This is what happens when you abandon civic nationalism. So the ethno-nationalists say the problem is diversity itself. The solution is a separation or deportation or some kind of ethnic reorganization of the country. And honestly, if the current trajectory does continue, they're going to win the argument. Not because they're right about human nature or let's just say racial incompatibility, but because we'll have proven that civic nationalism doesn't work, because we'll be abandoning everything that made it work in the first place. Okay? And here's the thing that you need to understand. And understand this, because if you don't get it by now, we're already fucked. Civic nationalism can work. It has worked, but we abandoned it. Okay? We let corporations, leftists destroy every mechanism that made it function. And now we're sitting on the wreckage pretending that we don't know what happened. Okay? So what did we destroy? And what does civic nationalism, or what was it actually before we killed it? And as an immigrant, first generation, I'll tell you what it was because I got to experience it myself. And we'll start with the difference between having a country and watching it fragment into the fucking tribal warfare that we have today. So civic nationalism says that your identity as an American is based on shared values and shared participation in the civic life, right? It's not on blood, it's not on ethnicity, not on what your ancestors look like, but whether or not you speak the language, whether you know the history, whether you accept the foundational principles, whether you participate in the community, whether you're American in culture and values and identity, not just in passport status. That's a piece of fucking paper. This is completely different from the multiculturalist bullshit that we have now where everyone maintains their separate identity, aka hyphenated Americans, and we just coexist without any shared values. And that is completely different from ethno-nationalism, where only a certain ethnic group can truly belong. So civic nationalism rejects both of those. It says anyone can become American, but becoming American fucking means something. It's not automatic. It's not the geography. It's not simply a passport. It's something that takes years and has real requirements, has real consequences. Okay? And here's what that system actually looked like when it worked. And before we destroyed this entire thing. First, language requirements were one simple one, right? Mandatory. Everyone who came here learned English to functional fluency, all right? Not ordering a McDonald's English, real fucking English. Reading newspapers, understanding political speeches, participating in parent-teacher conferences, communicating with your neighbors, because shared language is the foundation of everything else. And if you can't speak English, you can't integrate, period. Fair enough? Okay. We didn't do bilingual education that trapped kids in 4 languages. We didn't do government services in 47 fucking languages. We didn't do ballots in Spanish and Somali and Mandarin. You learned English or you couldn't function. There was economic and social pressure to integrate because ethnic enclaves weren't viable. And within a generation, immigrants spoke English and their kids only spoke English. But then we decided that that was racist. We decided requiring English was cultural imperialism. So we started doing bilingual everything. We started funding programs entirely based on these bullshit concepts. We actively kept people from learning English. We started celebrating ethnic enclaves instead of breaking them up. And now we've got third-generation immigrants who still don't speak English, and we act confused at how the fuck could this possibly happen. Civics requirements, we used to have those too. They actually meant that you understood what being an American was, what American values, what you had to become to be a citizen. You took a real test on American history and government and the principles. Not memorizing some fucking 50 questions or 50, how many states there are. There's 50 states. No. It meant understanding why we have free speech, even offensive speech. You understand? Why we separated the church and the state, why individual liberty matters more than collective harmony, why we have federalism and checks and balances, why equality before the law means religious law doesn't supersede civil law. You understand? And the test included real scenarios where American values conflict with traditional cultural values. If your religion, for example, says that women shouldn't be educated and American law says they must be, which wins? If your culture says blasphemy should be punished and American law protects offensive speech, which wins? If your tradition, for example, says honor violence is justified or honor killings, whatever you want to call it, and American law calls that murder, which wins? And if you couldn't say American law wins every single time, go back to your fucking country. But we gutted that too. You see, we turned the citizen test into a fucking joke. We made it multiple choice, some bullshit trivia that you can pass by memorizing the answers without actually understanding anything. We stopped asking whether people actually accept American values because that might exclude people whose values are incompatible with liberal democracy. And now we've got communities operating under parallel legal systems, and we wonder how that's fucking possible. You actually had things like community participation, and that meant you actually engaged in American civic life. You didn't just live in an ethnic enclave speaking your own language and maintaining foreign allegiances. You participated. You voted in local elections. You volunteered. You joined organizations. You interacted with Americans from different backgrounds all the time. You showed up. You contributed. You became a part of the community instead of living parallel to it. And this wasn't optional. There was a social pressure to participate. They had economic incentives to integrate, cultural expectations that were here to become American, not just extract benefits. And within a generation, people were participating in American civil life. Why? Because that's what Americans did. We've even lost that. Okay? We killed it. We celebrated ethnic enclaves as vibrant, diverse communities instead of integration failures. We incentivized people to maintain foreign identities through these ethnic grievances and ethnic grievance politics. We told people that becoming American was selling out. We made it economically viable to live your entire fucking life in an ethnic bubble. And now we got people who've been here 30 plus years and they've never had a conversation with someone outside of their ethnic group. That's insane. And the critical part and the part that makes the whole system work, when American values conflicted with ancestral values, American values won. Non-negotiable. If your religion said that women were subordinate, American law said they're equal, and you followed American law. End of story. That's it. No discussion. If your culture practiced honor killings or female genital mutilation or forced marriages, those were crimes, and you didn't get to do them. If your tradition said apostates should be killed or blasphemers, for example, punished, American law protected religious freedom and free speech, and you had to accept that, period. You didn't get to recreate the society you left, motherfucker. You don't get to impose Sharia law in your neighborhood. You don't get to maintain practices that violate American values and claim cultural protection. You were here to become American, and American values superseded your cultural bullshit when they conflicted. But we abandoned that too. So we decided that expecting people to adopt American values was cultural imperialism. We decided that all the cultures are equally valid, even when they're fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy. And they're not even fucking equal whatsoever. Some cultures are dog shit. We started accommodating practices that violated American principles because diversity. And now we got honor killings in fucking Texas. And you got females being mutilated in Michigan. And you got Islamic courts operating in Minnesota. And everyone acts like, yeah, this is fine, bro. That's their carve out. This is cool. This is what makes America American. All the things I listed before, this is what civic nationalism was. This is what the system that integrated tens of millions of immigrants from everywhere and built the most successful multi-ethnic democracy in history. And we deliberately destroy those principles. We dismantle every mechanism that made it work. And now we're sitting here in the fucking ruins and we're wondering, why is integration failing? And let's be fucking clear about what works and what doesn't, because we have the data. Okay, some immigrant groups integrate extremely well and some don't. And the pattern's not fucking random. East Asians, they integrate within a generation. They learn English. They work hard. They start businesses. Their kids excel in school. Their crime rates are actually lower than native-born Americans. They become American while maintaining their heritage, right? An example, Nigerian immigrants, they're the most educated group in America. That might shock some people. And Indians become engineers and doctors. It's funny to say Indians, engineers, and doctors. And Vietnamese, all their refugees that came here with nothing to show have fully integrated. They've become American. Okay. Meanwhile, other groups, they show persistent failure across multiple generations, third and fourth generation, who still don't speak English fluently, who still identify primarily with the ancestral country. They have higher crime rates, lower education attainment. They have higher welfare dependency. And this pattern holds across multiple groups. And we're not allowed to notice this because noticing patterns is racist, even though the pattern is most likely cultural. And I won't even give them, okay, fine. If you wanted to make it racial, say maybe sometimes it's racial. Use the racial argument if you want, if you're an ethno-national. Fine, you have that argument. I'll say it's more nurture because I've seen it succeed before. So, okay, if we have all the civic duties that we used to have, then the lower operating, lower success cultures or by race or whatever little fucking thing you want to designate will naturally be filtered out of the country. Do you understand? Because standards filter lower quality people out. That's the simple fix to a lot of this, right? We want a culture that values education, hard work, and that integrates. Not the cultures where you come from a place that fucks goats, honor kills shits in streets, for example. Yeah, and you find that acceptable? No, we don't do that here. We don't do cousin marriages, okay? Women aren't property over here. Where religious law supersedes civil law. We don't care about your Sharia bullshit, okay? Blasphemy doesn't make you get stoned to death. So those values are incompatible with our democracy. They're incompatible with the individual liberty, incompatible with the equality before the law. And when you import people from those cultures without requiring them to abandon the incompatible practices that they have, you get the parallel societies that are operating under different legal and the moral frameworks. You get this European-style disaster where entire neighborhoods are governed by religious law instead of national law. That's fucking insane. This isn't bigotry, you guys. This is just recognizing that some cultural practices are compatible with the American constitutional values and just some are not. And when they're not compatible with the American values, get the fuck out. Don't bring those people in. They will not be American because they will refuse American values. If they can't accept that, they don't belong here. But we gave up on those basic requirements on what it meant to be an American. We decided that requiring people to abandon those incompatible cultural practices is somehow discrimination against them. We decided that we have to cater to them, that all cultures deserve equal respect, even when they practice things that fully violate our values. And how are we dealing with the consequences of importing the populations of millions of people that are never integrating, never required to integrate? Well, look around you. Look at how that's working out, right? And who do you blame? Well, the corporate class. For one, the corporate class, they want to profit from cheap, unintegrated labor. They love having workers whose visa status, for example, will depend on their employer, so they can't complain, can't do shit. They love having divided populations that can't unite against them. They love having ethnic communities because they can exploit them all separately, one at a time. They love having people fighting over these cultural issues instead of noticing that they're all getting robbed. This is what the elite love this. And the political class, they want the same thing. I told you, the Republicans, they love their cheap labor for all their Repub donors. They love a wedge issue because this is always something that they can run on. Democrats, they want future voters. We know that. Why do you think they imported fucking 20 million of them and did black flights all over the country? Because it's free votes. No ID, no voter ID. That's crazy. Call it what it is. And then they have the ability to call you racist if you call them out on that. So both sides benefit from the broken borders and the failed integration. And fixing the system would require confronting their donors, right? And losing political ammunition. All our politicians are bought. You can't even run for president without getting on your knees for 100 millis from billionaires, multiple hundreds of millis, right? The activist class, they need it too. Their entire existence depends on grievance politics. If immigrants actually integrated, they'd lose their client base pretty much, and their funding, and their moral authority. So they have every incentive to keep people unintegrated. This is the conundrum of the bleeding heart liberal. They'll keep them resentful, they'll keep them dependent, and on ethnic advocacy is what they survive on. And they'll call any integration requirement, forcing them to be like us, white supremacy. Because integration destroys their business model. This is all about the Benjis, okay? Not about helping people. So we're fighting corporate interests that profit from all the exploitation, political interests that benefit from all the division, and activist interests that depend on permanent grievance, all of them working together to prevent integration and maintain this ethnic fragmentation in our country. And they've been winning for 40 years, okay? The result is literally exactly what you're seeing right now, today. Integration failure, we're talking across multiple generations, ethnic enclaves everywhere, little Haiti, little this, little that. Sick of seeing it. They're functioning as like foreign territory, declining social trust. Can't even go to fucking Miami with that. You have to speak Spanish. What kind of shit is that? You have tribal politics everywhere. Communities that don't feel like America. You got kids growing up without shared identity. And if the current trends continue, you'll completely fragment the country. And the ethno-nationalists are watching this. They're seeing the failure. They're observing all the demographic replacement, right? They're experiencing the loss of social cohesion. And they're concluding that civic nationalism was always impossible, that diversity inevitably leads to conflict, that the only solutions are ethnic separation or deportation, or accepting the permanent Balkanization that follows. And if we don't rebuild civic nationalism, I'm telling you, and if we don't prove that it can work, their arguments become more and more pervasive, or I should say persuasive, every single year. We're at a decision point in this country. We can fight to rebuild real civic nationalism with real integration requirements while we still have the political power to do it. Or we can watch the country fragment. Those are the options. There's no third option here where we keep doing what we're doing and everything just works out. It's not how it works. The window is closing, you guys. Maybe 10 years, maybe 15, before demographic shifts make this politically impossible to enforce integration, right? Before the ethnic bloc voting means no politician can win without pandering to some ethnic grievance. The founding population becomes a minority, and they'll lose the ability to enforce civic standards. And once that window closes, it's over. We have Balkanization, that's permanent. So the question is whether, are we willing to fight? Are we willing to demand real borders, real assimilation, real consequences? Whether we're willing to tell the corporations, the activists, the politicians to fuck off, right? Do we understand that we're in a race against time and we're almost out of runway? This is not a left versus right. This is about whether America continues to exist as a nation with shared identity, or whether we accept fragmentation into ethnic tribes with no common ground. And that choice is being made right now by what we tolerate and what we demand. Just look at Europe, and you'll understand that this is our future. Sweden 30 years ago, compared to today, dude, they have grenade attacks and gang violence and no-go zones. France, they have suburbs that are foreign territory practically. And Germany is full of parallel societies. England has grooming gangs everywhere that operates for decades. They can't investigate anything. If you say something on Instagram, you'll get labeled racist, and then they'll come and arrest you for a fucking tweet. We're like 20 years behind them. We're on the same exact trajectory. We're not special. We're not immune to this shit. Civic nationalism works when you do it, and it fails horribly when you abandon it. And we abandoned it. We're seeing this failure. The bill's coming due real quick for us. It'll make the current problems look like paradise. I'm telling you this. And if we don't fix this now, while we can, before this Balkanization shit becomes irreversible, the only thing that's left is catastrophe, and that's civil war, which is what we're trying to avoid. And then this is where we have to get into the next part of the conversation. So I'll reiterate what I said, and now we're going to lay out what happens if the ethno-nationalists end up being correct in the end. So this is the alternative of what you have to look forward to if, say, civic nationalism cannot work, never will work. Let's entertain the argument. So to reiterate, I laid out what the real integration looks like for you guys when it was language, civic education, assimilation to the American values, right? And all its identity. And some people will be like, it sounds great in theory, but the system will never allow for it, right? We're way past the point where any of this matters. Demographics are too far gone. Okay, the window, it already closed. I get it. Honestly, you might be right. So let's take the ethno-nationalist critique seriously here. And we'll ask the uncomfortable question, what if civic nationalism actually is impossible at this point? What if the only realistic option are mass deportations or ethnic partitioning or accepting permanent tribal conflict? And what does that world look like when you game out 15, 20, 30 years from now? Okay. Ethno-nationalists aren't stupid. Okay. The smart ones aren't just screaming about that blood and soil shit. That's the difference. They're just looking at the integration failure. And it's across multiple generations. I have to say that because that matters. They're watching what happened to the European cities, okay? All the ethnic enclaving, all that shit. And they're observing the demographic projections that shows whites becoming a minority while immigrants from incompatible cultures become the majority. And they're coming to logical conclusions based on observable patterns. And if you're going to reject their solutions, you need to actually engage with their arguments instead of just calling them racist and, hoping that reality changes, because it won't. We have to start with the strongest points that they have. The ones that aren't easy to actually dismiss because these ones are backed with data and historical precedent. So integration is failing and has been failing for decades. Third and fourth generation immigrants in some communities still don't speak English. We've established this. They still primarily identify with their ancestral homeland. We've identified this. They have higher crime rates. They have lower education. They have higher welfare needs. They're super dependent on the state. And this isn't a temporary adjustment period. This is permanent failure across generations, which suggests that maybe mass assimilation from certain cultures into Western democracy just doesn't work the way we pretend it does, okay? Somali refugees in Minnesota, 30 years in America, integration rates abysmal. Language acquisition, poor, to say the best of that. Employment, horrible. Welfare dependency, high. Radicalization, that's a documented problem there. And this is after 3 decades and billions in resettlement assistance and language programs and job training. At what point do you admit that some populations just don't integrate into secular societies? At what point do you stop blaming the program and start acknowledging the cultural distance matters? Yes? Hispanic immigration, they show similar issues. You got fourth generations in, some in California, Texas communities. English proficiency is still not universal. Educational attainment still lags. Entire cities where Spanish is the functional primary language and American identity barely exists. People waving Mexican flags at protests against American immigration enforcement. They're celebrating Cinco de Mayo, but not July 4th. And they send remittances to Mexico while they're collecting benefits here. Kids who identify as Mexican, not American. How? Why? And you're supposed to believe that this is successful integration? Cultural compatibility isn't some racist abstraction. It's measurable reality. When you import people from societies where honor killing is acceptable, where female genital mutilation is practiced, women are fucking property, cousin marriages is normal, religious law supersedes civil law, blasphemy is death, apostates killed, those values don't evaporate because someone crosses a border. It's not magic. They persist across generations, passed down to the children. And then you end up with these parallel societies operating under fundamentally different moral frameworks. Poll Muslim populations in Western countries to ask them about the attitudes towards something like free speech, women's rights, homosexuality, religious freedom, whatever it is, democracy itself. It doesn't matter. What do you think the numbers show? Large percentages of them hold views completely incompatible with Western values. And this doesn't improve with second or third generation. Sometimes it actually gets worse because the kids radicalize online and they reject integration as Western corruption. So you're not creating Americans with different backgrounds. You're just creating hostile foreign populations living on American territory, okay? The state won't enforce civic nationalism even if we wanted it to, because the state has been captured by corporate interests that profit from the cheap labor, the leftist activists who treat any assimilation requirement as white supremacy. Every attempt to enforce English requirement gets sued by fucking activist organizations. Every attempt to limit immigration gets blocked by all these federal judges. Every deportation of every fucking criminal gets protested as racist. Sanctuary cities openly defy federal law. Schools actively discourage assimilation through bilingual education and ethnic studies that teach kids America's equal. So the corporations are lobbying for all this unlimited H-1B visa and agricultural workers because they want, or I should say, they don't even want to pay American wages. They want to suppress wages. So even if civic nationalism could theoretically work, and I'm making this argument for the ethno-nationalists, it can't work in practice because the institutions required to enforce it have been dismantled or captured. And they're not coming back without some kind of revolutionary political change that seems increasingly impossible given the demographic shifts, right? And speaking of demographic shifts, whites will be a minority nationally within 15 to 20 years. They're already a minority in multiple states. And once that happens, you lose this political power to enforce any integration requirements because the new majority has no interest in assimilating into a culture that's no longer dominant. You can't maintain civic nationalism when the majority population has no connection or no investment in the founding culture and its values. You can't expect immigrants to integrate into American civic identity when America's civic identity itself is being systematically dismantled and replaced with ethnic grievance and identity politics. So the demographic window for restoring civic nationalism is closing rapidly. And maybe it already closed. And once you cross that threshold where the founding population becomes a minority, the whole project becomes impossible because you're asking the new majority to assimilate into something they outnumber, which has never worked anywhere in history, ever. And then there's the human nature argument. That's this other half of this. The one that's really uncomfortable, that it's, and uncomfortable if you're a leftist too, diversity plus proximity equals conflict. This is the baseline statement of humanity across all of recorded history. Multi-ethnic empires always collapse. The Roman Empire collapsed. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. Austria-Hungary collapsed. Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, all of them fell apart along ethnic lines. Civic nationalism is the exception, not the rule. And it only worked in America because of unique circumstances that no longer exist. Same thing with the decline of the Roman Empire. They had civic nationalist policies, and then they handed out citizenship to all in the empire. It was not earned. We're following a similar path in the modern world. So they have research on social trust that shows diversity reduces cohesion, reduces cooperation in neighborhoods. It increases ethnic competition for resources, political power. And if this pattern holds across countries and time periods, the only way you get diverse societies that function are through authoritarian control that suppresses ethnic conflict or by maintaining a dominant majority that enforces cultural norms. And America has neither anymore. We abandoned assimilation and we're losing the demographic majority, which means that we're heading towards the historical norm of ethnic fragmentation and violence. So those are the arguments that integration failure is documented and we're headed towards it. And cultural incompatibility is real. The state won't enforce assimilation. Demographics have shifted, right? We're past the tipping point, and the human tribal nature makes diversity and society inherently impossible and unstable, and it leads to violence, okay? We can't pretend that these aren't legitimate concerns, because that's how you lose the argument. So what the ethno-nationalist solutions actually look like if we were to have them. Because if, let's say, civic nationalism really is impossible, then we need to know what are the alternatives here, and what do they say the alternatives are? Whether they're better, right? Than trying, is that better? You would say than fixing a broken system. So I will say no. Okay, they're not better, because to actually fix it in the blood and soil scenario, you're going to have to live in a world that you don't want to. Okay, and we're going to talk about it right now. Number one, and it comes into three, by the way. Let me break this down into three. So if we take that approach, ethno-nationalist, there's probably three ways that you could fix society, you could say, okay? And version one is probably the simplest that we all know of, mass deportation. You identify everyone who's not assimilating or who's here illegally or who's from incompatible cultures, and you remove them, like all of them. I mean, tens of millions of people. You set a fucking deadline, and then you start. Probably the largest forced population transfer in human history. And supposedly that this will solve the problem by getting rid of the populations that refuse to integrate. Okay, that's fair enough. Okay, so let's game this out with an actual timeline. Let's say it's 2038, for example. You've had 15 or more years of fucking immigration. Nobody's really stopped it because both parties are benefiting it. Trump maybe slowed the spigot. A Democrat comes later. He starts it up again. We don't have the political balls to really follow this through. We don't get any more deportations here of a sizable amount, yada, yada, yada. Okay. Then you have 15 years of integration failure on top of what we already have. It's getting worse. You have escalating ethnic violence. You'll have European-style no-go zones in American cities very soon, where police don't even go, and foreign law is getting enforced. You got cartel violence spilling across the border, turning the Southwest to a fucking war zone. You got white nationalism, Hispanic nationalism, black nationalism, all organizing politically and violently. You got radicals on every side saying separation is the only answer. And somehow an actual ethno-nationalist wins the presidency on a platform of mass deportation. Let's say that happens, right? What does this look like, actually? Okay, the first problem is identifying who goes. And by 2038, we're not talking about 11 million illegal immigrants, 20 million, whatever's in here from 2024. We're talking about probably, if this keeps going, we could have 50 fucking million people minimum, because you had 2 or more decades of this bullshit continuing. You got second and third and fourth generations who never integrated. You got legal immigrants from the past 50 years who the ethno-nationalists also argue that need to leave because they've changed the demographics and they're not American in culture or values. So how do you decide who gets deported? Is it just the illegals? Probably 40 million by then, right? Or is it anyone who doesn't speak English after being here for, say, 10 years? Or anyone on welfare? Or anyone with a criminal record? Or anyone that's from a Muslim country, for example, who identifies primarily with a foreign nationality, someone like that as well? Anyone married to a foreign national? Anyone whose kids don't speak English, right? And who makes these determinations? You have to apply this in the real world. Because by this point, you're talking about deporting like a quarter or a third of the country. Can you imagine getting rid of 25% of the population? All right, that's problem one. You need to know. Problem two, you need infrastructure to do this. And I'm not talking about expanding ICE from 20,000 to 40,000 agents. You're going to need hundreds of thousands of enforcement personnel. You need federal agents. You're going to need military personnel. You're going to need detention facilities that can house millions of people simultaneously while processing them. You're going to need entire cities worth of detention capacity. You're going to need fucking planes and buses and trains. They're going to have to be running 24/7 for years. Years. You're going to need cooperation from what? State? Municipalities? All by 2038, all of them that have a majority immigrant population, you're going to need support from them. Think about that. You don't think they will actively resist federal authority? They're already doing it in Portland. You need to overcome not just activist judges, but entire state governments that threaten secession rather than comply. Remember I told you at the very beginning what would happen if Oregon and Washington and California made their little trilateral agreement to tell the Fed to fuck off? Then you need to deal with the sanctuary cities, not just, well, I should say, you would need to deal then with sanctuary states, not just sanctuary cities. So you're going to need federal forces prepared to occupy entire states that refuse cooperation. And this starts looking less like immigration enforcement and more like military occupation of American territory, right? That's the second problem. The third problem is economic devastation. And by 2038, let's just say entire sectors of the economy, just like today, are completely dependent on immigrant labor. Agriculture, food processing, right? Construction, transportation, healthcare, hospitality, technology, all of them. You remove something like 50 million workers and the economy doesn't contract. It fucking implodes. We're talking about immediate food shortages because no one's harvesting crops or working in meat packing plants. We're talking construction grinding to a fucking halt, hospitals closing because they can't staff supply chains. All that shit is collapsing. Businesses are shuttering by the hundreds of thousands. That's what happens when you do mass deportation on a fast enough scale. The employment rate among the remaining population skyrockets because jobs just don't magically transfer to Americans. The jobs actually disappear when the business collapses. Prices spike on everything because supply collapses while demand remains. You get simultaneous inflation and depression, and the stock market crashes. Retirement will all those accounts evaporate, and the federal budget implodes because tax revenue collapses while you're spending trillions potentially on deportation infrastructure. And you're trying to manage all of this while conducting the largest forced migration in human history. Okay? That's the third problem. Fourth problem, you have the humanitarian catastrophe. You have to deport, say, 50 million people over several years. You're not sending back just criminals and recent arrivals. You may be tearing apart families that have been here for 30, 40 years. You're deporting American-born children because their parents are here illegally. You're sending people who came here as infants back to countries they have no memory of. This is the ethno-nationalist argument. You understand how this looks to everyone else, including your fellow Americans? It's a bit rough on the optics, and you need optics to win this war. You see what I'm saying? So you're breaking up families where some members actually have citizenship and others don't. So that's another problem. You're going to have to revoke citizenship for those that already have it. Another conundrum, right? Then you have the receiving countries, because you think Mexico is going to want all these people? They're not accepting 50 fucking million people dumped on their border. You think El Salvador is going to take back the millions they consider American? You think Somalia is going to accept all these fucking refugees who've been gone for like 30 years? So you're going to create massive refugee camps on the border. You're creating a humanitarian disaster. That's what that is. And imagine that footage being broadcast globally every single day. You got crying children, all that shit. Millions of people on the border in camps, from fucking parents to elderly. People being deported to countries they haven't seen in 50 years, or sending them off to like other places, dropping them off in the middle of Africa somewhere. 50 years, guys. Families all destroyed. This is because of our system and how much it's failed. Overcrowded detention facilities. Can you imagine what people would think about? So, okay, you're willing to take the bad optics, create the humanitarian crisis. Okay. The fifth problem. What will the international response be, realistically? And by 2038, think about this, not just diplomatic pressure. You could have coordinated economic warfare. Countries could sanction the United States by then. Maybe China has become a dominant enough trading partner that they're not afraid to stand up to the United States by 2038. The EU could be doing an embargo on us. China could be dumping U.S. Treasury bonds. Oil-producing countries could refuse to sell. This could all be possible by 2038. What if we piss Canada off so much that the conservatives lost? We made fun of them and said we would treat them as a 51st state. We challenged their sovereignty. We then said we would buy Greenland. In American politics, that was Trump being funny as fuck. That was great. But Canadians were not happy with that. Europeans didn't like their sovereignty threatened. So we're making enemies out of allies? You don't think this could be possible? People are already de-dollarizing on an international market. As of, I think, a few days ago, there is now more gold being bought than our own treasury notes. So we could be ending up as a pariah state. Think about that. Could countries then meddle in our shit and fund opposition movements inside America directly? Right? Could also American citizens who don't agree with these policies become refugees and they'll flee to different nations? And you're trying to hold this economy together during all of this. mass deportation, while the entire world is trying to destroy you economically. Okay? Think about that. Another problem, for example, the domestic resistance, because we talked about Americans fleeing, but okay, we've seen from Portland, we already have to escalate to violence. And by 2038, just imagine that. You're not dealing with just protesters, you're dealing with actually armed resistance by then. Ethnic communities that fight back when the federal forces try to round people up. They're already doing it today. What do you think another 20 years of this shit is going to look like? 10 more years of this shit. States that refuse to cooperate and mobilize their National Guards against federal authority. Portland already told their police not to help federal agents. That's insurrection. Okay. We'll have networks smuggling people, hiding them, employers refusing to comply, hiding workers in sanctuary city. That's already happened, right? The sanctuary city will become the sanctuary state. We're just inflaming them, right? You've got ethnic militias that will be forming to protect their communities from this shit. You're going to have shootouts between federal agents and community defenders, which is already happening. But imagine on a much larger scale. You got governors that are threatening to deploy state forces against federal forces. Entire regions that will reject federal authority if you try to ramp up what the ethno-nationalists want to do. Think about it, the car bombs, targeting deportation facilities, assassination of federal officials, right? Coordinated attacks on detention centers, all that stuff. And the federal response has to be overwhelming force, like complete military occupation, martial law in multiple states. And now you're in a low intensity civil war. So mass deportation in 2035, 2040-ish, that timeline or whatever timeline you're thinking, it's not just some administrative process. This is a multi-year national catastrophe that destroys our economy and it creates international isolation potentially and generates unprecedented humanitarian crisis. And then it might trigger armed conflicts across multiple states. And even if you somehow succeed, even if federal forces manage to, say, deport 50 million people over the course of 5 to 10 years of intense violence and economic collapse, you created a smoking crater where America used to be. We spend trillions of dollars we don't have, and we killed probably thousands in violence, and we destroyed the economy, and we got isolated ourselves internationally. And then we've traumatized the entire generation. And we haven't solved the underlying problem, because the underlying problem was abandoning civic nationalism and failing to enforce integration. And unless you rebuild those systems, unless you fix the structural issues that created the mess in the first place, you're just going to end up back here in another 20 years, and the cycle will repeat. Okay? Version 2 of this, for example, the partitioning argument that we had earlier. You accept that America can't function as a unified country anymore. Demographics and culture have completely fragmented too deeply, so you divide the country. Whites get certain states, Hispanics get the Southwest, blacks get the Southeast, maybe Asians get the West Coast, everyone gets their own little territory and their own government. You formalize this shit, the Balkanization that's already happening informally, and supposedly this solves the problem by accepting separation as permanent and managing it, before it becomes violent. Okay? Game this out too, because partition sounds real clean in theory. Everyone gets their own space. Finally, we separate peacefully, right? Freedom of association. But in practice, it's Yugoslavia. It's the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's every failed multi-ethnic empire collapsing into violence over borders and resources again. First problem is the simplest one. That happens to everybody. Drawing the lines. Simple, yeah? Almost never. How do you decide which states go to which ethnic group? Do you go by the current demographics, even though those demographics are mixed? Do you do population transfers where people have to move to their designated ethnic territory? What happens to the cities that are highly diverse? What happens to people in the wrong territory? Do they get forced out or do they stay as minorities with no political power? California is majority Hispanic, but has a huge white and Asian population. Does everyone who's not Hispanic get forced out? Where do they go? Texas? Because Texas is mixed. Florida is mixed. New York is mixed. Every major city is diverse. So are you going to do forced population transfers on top of the partition? Are you going to move tens of millions of people to match these new ethnic borders? And what happens next? What happens to those people who refuse to go? Just a question. The second problem is what happens economically when you fragment the integrated economy that made America so powerful. And the moment you partition everything, you got separate countries with separate currencies, potentially separate trade policies, separate regulations, legal systems, entire economic unions. They all dissolve. And now there's new countries that have to negotiate trade with each other like foreign fucking nations do. And most of them aren't economically viable alone. Let's just say the white ethno-state in the Mountain West, they don't have ports, doesn't have access to resources, doesn't have the population to maintain infrastructure. The Hispanic Southwest has resources but no industrial base. The Black Southeast is impoverished and economically underdeveloped. None of these new countries can maintain the military or infrastructure or the social programs that existed under the unified system. So you've got economic collapse across all of them. Third, how the fuck do you divide the federal assets and the debts? Who gets the nuclear weapons? Who gets the military bases? Who gets the gold reserves, right? Who's getting the bitcoins? Just curious. Who assumes the $30 trillion in national debt? And how do you divide the Social Security and Medicare obligations to the people who paid in it for 40 years? Do we just tell them to fuck off? Everyone's retirement is gone. What happens to the interstate highway too, by the way? The whole power grid, the water rights, the federal lands. You got 4 to 5 new countries all claiming that they deserve a lion's share, right? The fourth problem is borders and security. Who defends the borders between all these ethnic states? What happens when there's the dispute, for example? What happens to ethnic minorities left in the wrong territory? Do they get ethnic cleansing? Do they get protection? Who protects them? And what happens when the Hispanic Southwest decides it wants more territory and the white Mountain West says no? Do they go to war? Who arbitrates? Who enforces that? Right? Another problem is this doesn't stay peaceful for long because the moment you start to partition, you've got border disputes and resource conflicts and ethnic minorities who feel threatened and want their own carve out. You got historical grievances and competing territorial claims. Water wars in the Southwest. Yeah, they're all 5 states are sharing water. You have neighboring ethnic states that hate each other. And then you've got the conditions for war. Wow, we solved so much. Yeah, let's give everybody their own shit. No, Yugoslavia is the model here for that. The multi-ethnic federation breaks apart along ethnic lines. Each fucking ethnic region declares independence. They immediately start fighting over territory and resources. You get ethnic cleansing then. The Balkan Wars. You get war crimes. Hundreds of thousands dead. Millions displaced. And decades of fucking conflict. And that's with international intervention. Trying to stop all of that shit. Imagine that in North America with nuclear weapons and no outside force strong enough to really intervene. The breakup of the Soviet Union is another model for this. 15 new countries were created. Multiple wars over border disputes, ethnic conflicts in multiple republics, yet economic collapse across probably all of them. And that's with Russia maintaining some coherence. Imagine if Russia had also fractured into ethnic regions. Complete collapse into violence. So partition will lead us to economic catastrophe and the integrated economy fragments, humanitarian disaster, and that's an understatement, as populations need to be transferred or cleansed, and multiple wars between the new ethnic states over borders and resources and minorities, and you end up with 4 to 5 failed states where one functional country used to be, and the violence continues for decades until a winner is born. Maybe. So then you reconstitute America? Winner takes all? Because if you successfully invade one, then you're going to regroup and then invade another one. It never ends. Version 3, you're going to have to accept the permanent Balkanization, but you're going to have to try to manage it through some other form of democracy. You give up on integration. You accept that America is now a collection of ethnic tribes with no shared identity. And you try to prevent them from killing each other through power sharing of some sort, some arrangement where each ethnic group gets guaranteed representation and veto power, something like Lebanon or Bosnia or Iraq. Well, let's look at how well those model works. Lebanon has been in a fucking civil war for like 15 years. It's barely functional state. 40 years later, still divided, still along sectarian lines, periodic violence, right? Economic stagnation, corruption is endemic everywhere. The infrastructure is shit. Bosnia, for example, they require international peacekeepers for decades and still has massive ethnic tensions and only peaceful because the international presence. And Iraq is a failed state held together by some periodic ethnic violence there as well. These are not success stories. These are just examples of how diversity without integration creates permanent dysfunction. You'll get ethnic factions competing for resources and power and coalition governments that can't function because nobody trusts each other. You'll get the corruption and the patronage networks based on ethnicity. You'll get the periodic violence, right, when tensions spike every once in a while. You'll get the economic stagnation because nobody invests in unstable multi-ethnic states where the rule of law is tribal in essence. And this is America's future if we don't fix civil nationalism. By 2040, you've got an ethnic bloc voting. Okay, politicians who overly represent their ethnic group. You'll have coalitions that barely function. Federal government is paralyzed because different ethnic factions can't agree on anything. States will be increasingly ignoring federal authority. Periodic riots and violence along ethnic lines, right? Fatigue, declining social trust, collapsing civic participation, economic stagnation, all of it. Businesses will start to flee the instability. The whole system slowly grinding toward failure. Okay? So those are the three, you could say, ethno-nationalist solutions when you actually game them out 15, 20 years into the future. The mass deportation with the whole humanitarian catastrophe and economic collapse, right? The border wars, the Balkanization, or your dysfunctional fucking democracy where we have carve-outs forever. So the ethno-nationalists will say, okay, yeah, those solutions are hard, they're messy, they create problems, but civic nationalism is impossible, Bo. You admitted integration is failing. The state won't enforce it. Demographics, they've shifted too far. We're out of time. So you're going to choose between impossible and catastrophic. Is that it? Catastrophic sounds better than surrender. Is that what you want? Or I should say catastrophic is not better than surrender. Surrender is the worst. You gave up completely. But I would choose a catastrophe over surrender. Do we just let the chips fall, give up? That's too much of a problem. We can't solve this one. That's the argument. That's the one we have to address head on. You see it in the comment section. So I can't wait for this all to collapse. Really? Do you know what collapse actually means? Your life gets infinitely harder. You already barely have 2 pennies to scrounge together. You're going to have no pennies in the future. Maybe you do have to accept one of these as a nightmare if civic nationalism can't be brought back. I don't think it's impossible. I just think it's hard as fuck. And I think it requires overcoming massive political obstacles. I'm not saying this shit will be one and done, okay? Or massive obstacle, confronting insanely powerful interests. And we're going to have really uncomfortable, non-PC conversations. And we're going to have to enforce some standards that will be called racist. But hard is not the same as impossible here. That's fine, right? So civic nationalism worked for better part of 200 years in America? It integrated tens of millions of immigrants from every continent. We created a shared national identity from diverse populations. The people that were coming here in the beginning, Italians weren't considered white. A bunch of white cultures, because they're going to say, well, it was only white cultures. Well, Italians, Irish people, they weren't even considered white. They were put in separate neighborhoods and frowned upon. And then there's Europe, all white people, constantly at war, killing each other. Today, Russia, Ukraine, fighting over what? Where are those blood and soil ties there? Isn't that crazy? Brother wars, that's what they call them. Yeah. So we still fight and kill one another. Where's the argument there? Do you see what I'm talking about? So we need a shared identity. A Russian is willing to kill a Ukrainian over something as abstract as NATO, which will never threaten Russia's borders. They have the second largest, if not the largest nuclear armament in the world. Russia can wipe you off the fucking map with a button. Nobody is taking any of their borders. This is just because they felt some kind of way about NATO. So then they'll kill their brothers. Their shared history means nothing. These are the same people with the same religion. Russia started in Kiev, the Kievan Rus, which was an offshoot of Swedish Vikings. Still kill each other, okay? Our system only stopped working when we deliberately abandoned it. We stopped requiring the English. We stopped teaching civics. We started calling assimilation racist. We let corporations dismantle the enforcement for their cheap fucking labor. We let leftists convince us that maintaining American identity was white supremacy. The failure of integration over the past 40 years isn't proof that civic nationalism can't work. It's proof that civic nationalism requires active enforcement by the state. It requires a state that controls borders and demands assimilation and punishes non-integration. It requires the cultural confidence to say that these are American values, and if you come here and adopt them, you can stay. And if you don't, you can get the fuck out, right? We can reject the multiculturalism in form of integration. It's not racist. We stopped doing all that and we abandoned our entire framework for what made this country successful. But we can rebuild this shit. We can start enforcing English requirements tomorrow. We could require civic tests that actually measure understanding of American values. We could tie welfare benefits to integration progress. We could deport people who refuse to integrate, for example, after a reasonable amount of time. We could prioritize immigration from cultures that historically integrate well. We could reduce the overall numbers to manageable levels. We could end the sanctuary cities. We could mandate E-Verify. We could even prosecute employers who hire the illegals. We could make birthright citizenship conditional on parental legal status. We could do all of these. Trump tried some of these, but we need a heavy hand of doing these and maybe even further, go further than this, okay? All of this is technically possible. None of this violates physics. It's just politically difficult because corporations oppose it and corporations pay for our politicians. Activists oppose it too. The judges will block some of this shit and the states will resist. But political difficulty is different from impossibility. I'm sick of that argument. And if the alternative is mass deportation, creating like civil war, or partitioning, creating failed states, or managed fucking decline into permanent like ethnic conflict, then maybe political difficulty is worth fighting through. Isn't it? Doesn't it sound better? The critical difference is civic nationalism. If you actually implement it with the real requirements and real enforcement, it'll let you maintain a country that functions. We will have controlled immigration. That's an asset. Real doctors and engineers, not the ones you laugh at, not fucking street shitters. Okay, it's not a liability. You can't integrate diverse populations that will integrate in the first place, that are welcome to have a shared identity. You can avoid all this catastrophic future scenarios, and you could address the legitimate integration concerns. Deport the fucking criminals and any person that refuses to integrate after being given an opportunity, say a time frame. But you can't just deport 50 fucking million people or whatever the number is. Just make real assimilation legal and make them work for it. Reduce the new immigration with a real fucking border. Levels that actually can integrate. Mass integration doesn't work. Bring a few of them, a few that benefit us, and slowly trickle them in. You do get to rebuild a social trust through the shared identity instead of this ethnic tribalism, all these carve-outs. You could create real incentives for people to become American instead of just living in America. This requires the confronting these corporate cocksuckers, all their interests from profiting all these cheap labor from a permanent underclass, these H-1B visa bullshit, all of that. All these fucking cocksucking activists and their goddamn fucking bleeding liberal hearts. Everything's bigotry to them. Fuck off. Okay, we have demographic realities here. Admitting that some cultures integrate better than others, right? Having these uncomfortable conversations about compatibility, enforcing these requirements, you'll be called racist. That's fine. Who cares? The alternative is worse. And we have to do this while there is still political power to do this, which means you have to act now before the demographic window closes completely. The ethno-nationalists are right about some things. Integration is failing in many cases. The current system is broken beyond reform in its current form. Demographic shifts create real challenges. Some cultures are compatible. Yes, they are, with liberal democracy or just democracy in general. More compatible than others. The state won't enforce all this shit without political revolution. This is what I mean by voting in no Democrat or no Republican. But they are wrong that the only solution is ethnic separation or mass deportation because those solutions create worse problems than they solve. The actual solution is the civic nationalism with real fucking teeth. You have to rebuild it to have some bite. We have to get serious about integration. We can't pretend that diversity is automatically strength. It's not. Look at Europe. It's fucking shit. American identity over having ethnic identity. You want to belong here? You're not a hyphenated American. You're just American. Where you came from? Fuck off. Don't want to hear it. Where are you from? You tell me the city you're from. I don't give a shit where you were born. As long as you cross the border, you're in America and you speak English. When I ask you where you're from, you tell me the city, bitch. I don't give a fuck what other part of the world you came from. That's a distant memory. You have to have the balls to say these are our values. And you adopt them or you don't. But you don't get the fucking stay. And this isn't easy politically. And who gives a shit? We don't vote for easy politics anyway. The country's already fucking ruined. All these policies that they're instituting are just popular with the current elite. We have to fight all the corporate interests. That's the issue. The activist judges, the sanctuary jurisdictions, everyone who benefits from the broken borders and the failed integration. Fuck them all. But it is possible. It's better than those alternatives I listed. And we're running out of time, dude. I'm telling you. You have to implement this shit before the demographics and the culture shifts make it impossible. We probably have maybe 10 years. You got 2 presidential cycles before that window maybe closes forever. And then the ethno-nationalist predictions become self-fulfilling. Because if we fail to rebuild, the alternative is so fucked. Do you want to go into the 3 alternative futures? They're not so abstract. They're where current trends are leading right now, today. It's not magic. You don't have to, it's not an alternate universe. Should we continue down this path? This is where we're going. Economic collapse and civil war. That's what happens if we wait too long and the backlash becomes violent. I don't know about you, but I don't want to see America getting balkanized with carve-outs or attempting to do a real mass deportation when it's already too late, right? Or where we're stuck in 2040 with a fucking ethnic coalition government where everybody needs equal representation and shit. Barely functioning like a fucking failed third world country. Are we going to end up in tribal politics as if this is like the normal way? Well, this is crazy, dude. All these futures end in catastrophe. All of it is going to be violence and economic collapse and the destruction of everything that made America exceptional. And that sucks. Maybe we're already gone, dude. Maybe the demographics, they have shifted past the point of recovery. We don't even have the real stats. We don't even know what the birth rates are, really. We don't even know how many illegals came in the country. We actually don't even know, truly. Maybe the cultural fragmentation is irreversible. I don't know, but I'm not ready to accept that yet. And neither should you be. We're at a decision point, and probably the last one, to be completely honest. We either fight to rebuild the civic nationalism with real integration, the real American values, the real American identity, while we still have this political power to do it, or we accept. We balkanize everything that comes with that shit. Even if civic nationalism is a long shot, even if it requires all these obstacles, even if we have to confront all these fucking terms of racist, bigot, supremacist, all this shit, enforcing basic standards on people, all that shit, it's still better than accepting those alternative futures. Don't you think? Do we have the balls to get this done? Do our politicians, do we have real leaders that have the balls to get this done? We have to tell all these activists to fuck off when they try to oppose these ideas. We are in a race against demographic time. The window is closing fast. And I think we're already close to that point, you know? And once we do, by the way, once the shift is already far gone, the political will completely evaporate. But we're not there yet, currently, to date. We're not there. We still have a shot, guys. We still have a window. We need to take it. You know, they say you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.